Greetings! In this video series, we're going to be talking about sequential logic, and we're going to write our very first set of Python programs that can get inputs from the user, process them in some way, and produce an output. In this video, we're focusing on step 1 of that process, which is just getting the inputs. For this lesson, we're going to be talking about how to get a value from the user and how to store that value in a variable. We're also going to talk about the idea of data types, which will be important when we store a variable. We want to make sure that we are storing it in a way that we can use it afterwards. To remind us where we are in the UDIT process, remember that up until now we primarily focused on understanding our problems and designing our solution. Now we're going to focus on implementing and testing. Understanding and designing is still very important for us because we need to make sure that we have a good plan for solving our problem, and the more time we invest up here, the less time we'll have to spend here. In sequential logic, we're trying to write programs that can execute the same set of steps in order without any branches or deviations. The idea is that there's no decisions that need to be made, it's just perform this set of steps to get from A to B. The most basic type of sequential flow algorithm we'll talk about in this class is referred to as input, process, output. In an input, we're getting values somehow, usually from the user. In process, we're usually doing some form of math or comparison. And then in output, we are using the print function to get it to the screen. So here's an example of a sample IPO problem, one where we have to get some values from the user, calculate the average, and output the results to the screen. In this video, we're just going to focus on the part that's underlined here. How do we get two numbers from the user? So in this step, what we're primarily concerned about is how many values do you need to get? So in this case, it's clearly 2. And then we need to think about what are we getting? Are we getting numbers? Are we getting strings? Is this a floating point number? Does it have decimal points in it? Or is it an integer? Is it just a whole number? We also need to think about how we're getting that information from the user. So in Python, there's a function called input. And input basically lets you go ahead and the user type anything they want on the keyboard, and it will store that in a variable. So if you want to get a string, for example, here's what you would type: the name of the variable you want, and then the actual input function. But if you want to get an integer or a float, it's a little bit more complicated. You add this extra piece of text in front of it. So you're getting an input, and then you are telling Python with the int here that you want it to be interpreted as an integer. Here, the same thing. You're getting an input from the user, but you're telling Python that you want to get a floating point value. So this is important because when we are doing math, anytime we need to do math, we need to make sure that our variables contain numbers and not strings. And we want to make sure that our variables have meaningful names. Here, we're talking about, this is just an example, but we'd probably want to name our variables like number 1, number 2, something so that we can remember what it is that they are. So let's go ahead and show you how this all works. In Thony, you can go to the view menu and go hit variables. You'll get this window over here, and that will let us see what it is that what type of variables we are getting behind the scenes. And why don't we go ahead and write our logic design for the whole program right now, just to make sure that we understand what it is that we're doing. So the steps are, let's see, get a number from the user. And this little hashtag here means a comment. Python knows not to execute this, it's just notes to help us out. So we'll get another number from the user. We will calculate the average, and then we will print the result. So this is our input phase, right? This is also input. Calculating the average, this is our process. And this is our output. So you can see how IPO is laid out. So it's in that order. So let's go ahead and get the first value from the user. So if I go back here, I say I need a, let's say if it's a number, let's assume it's a floating point number. So we'll follow this template. Variable name equals float parenthesis input. Okay, I'll call my variable number 1, and then I will set it equal to float input. And you can see the purple here telling me that these are known keywords by Python. And if I run this program right now, I can just go ahead. It looks like it's not doing anything, but if I type a number like 123.45 and I press enter, you will see over here that it created a variable called number1 and it assigned it the value of 123.45. As a quick aside, look what happens if I forget to put the float in front of it. You'll see the quotes here. That means it's a string and I won't be able to do any math on it. So I'll just go ahead and reset it here. And we can do it again, right? We can copy and paste, and instead of calling it number1, we need to remember both numbers, so we'll have a variable called number1, which gets the first number the user types, and a variable called number2, which will get the second number the user types. So if I go over here, 123.45, and then 234.56, doesn't really matter, you'll see I have two variables now that are stored. To close out our discussion for today, let's talk a little bit more about variables and assignments. Variables can be thought of as a location in your computer's memory that we name where we can store information and get it later. So for example here, I can create a variable called myVariable and set it equal to the value of 10. This looks like algebra, and sometimes students get confused by thinking that what I'm saying here is that myVariable and 10 are equivalent to each other, but what I'm really saying is that I'm assigning myVariable the value of whatever's on the right hand side, and it can be a number, it can be a mathematical expression, it can be the input function like we just saw. You can think of variables as a bucket where I'm just dumping in a value. Right now, we're going to use variables to store strings and various types of numbers like integers and floats, but we'll do more with them later. And variable names have to start with a letter or an underscore, but they can have numbers in them. They just can't start with it. So here's a quick review so we can go over various types of assignment statements. This one's just like the previous slide, where we are creating a variable called velocity and we are storing the value 100 inside of it. Here is a common pattern. You'll see a lot more of this later in the course, where we're taking x and we are assigning it the value of whatever x currently is plus 1. So this is how we add 1 to a variable. This one here we saw in the coding example where we create a variable and we set it equal to whatever the user types. So whatever the user types, press enter, that value gets stored in name. And you'll recall here, because I don't put int or float in front of it, it's storing it as a string. And this last one here is one that you all will inevitably do, but this is actually illegal in Python. The key is that whenever we do an assignment statement, a variable has to be on the left side, and the value we want to assign it to is equal on the right hand side. So you can't do it this way, even though it makes perfect sense in math. So in this video, we've talked about the first stage of IPO. We talked about how to get values from the user, how to create variables, and most importantly, how to take that value the user typed and put it inside of a variable. So in the future videos, we're going to look at the idea of how to actually process that information, and most importantly, how to produce something for the user to see.